Thank you very much indeed for being here. Now, we're going to talk about the difference between you and Labour as we head to the election. But let's start with the here and now. Has the cost of living crisis ended?
Well, good morning, Laura. Perhaps I could just start by saying my thoughts are also with the Princess of Wales and the King, and how much I think we all admire their incredible stoicism. On the cost of living, we've had a very, very tough patch, caused actually by something you've been talking about this morning, the invasion of Ukraine, what's been happening in Russia. And I think people will welcome the fact that inflation has fallen, but we're not there yet. And we need to stick to the course because we need inflation to get down to 2%. The thing that will make the biggest difference for families up and down the country is when interest rates fall and therefore their mortgage rates start to fall.
Actually, the biggest thing, because not everybody owns a mortgage, but most people have a job. Most people work. Again, I mentioned it before, I'll mention it again. Inflation being lower is irrelevant when wages are not growing faster than inflation. Inflation dropping just means that prices are still rising, just slower than they were before. If wages aren't outpacing inflation, in real terms, you are still getting poorer. Interest rates coming down would be useful. He's not wrong to say interest rates coming down would help people out on things like mortgage payments. It would help the economy, help investment, all those things. The actual way to solve the cost of living crisis is to make people's wages in real terms be higher. So their wages are rising faster than prices are. That means you can afford more, and therefore we would go back to the previous paradigm. Whereas people have had the biggest fall in living standards since the Napoleonic Wars over the course of the cost of living crisis, to actually fix the problem, you would need wages to be higher than inflation for an extended period to allow people the time to be able to see their living standards go back to normal, or the previous normal that we did have before COVID hit. Cost of living was still high even before then. But just to say, oh, we've got inflation down, we've got interest rates down, that's not good enough. But then again, will this government ever have any kind of economic reforms that would allow people to bargain for higher wages? I think not.
And that comes in prospect. It's a decision by the Independent Bank of England, but comes in prospect when inflation is back down at 2%.
There are lots of things, though, that are still going up, and let's just look at them. A private rent up 9% since 2023. Council tax for Band D, your sort of average house, up by 5.1%. Petrol prices up 2.3 pence since January. And yet your colleague Andrea Leadsom, a member of the government, said the cost of living crisis is ended. And you yourself said this week that £100,000 was not a great salary. Isn't there a danger that actually you sound like you're in a parallel universe?
Well, no.
I mean, they do literally live in a parallel universe. It literally isn't incorrect to say that they don't, because they do. Because, first of all, to say the cost of living crisis has ended would mean that we would be back to our purchasing power that we had before it started, which we haven't. Inflation happened, prices rose ahead of wages. Inflation outpaced wages for a very long period, so we got much poorer in real terms. Wages haven't risen, at least appreciably, in relation to inflation. So our cost of living is still bad. It's still bad. As has been pointed out in chat, we need proper, sustained wage growth above inflation for a long period of time to end the cost of living crisis. That's the only way to solve this problem. And second of all, I think we need to have a proper discussion about the £100,000 beat that he put out, saying it's not a huge salary. Now, arguably, it is a large salary. Don't want to get into the semantics of what adjective you use, but it is a large salary. It's in the top 2 to 3% of earners in the UK. But we seem to spend a lot of our time worrying about salary differences, when, even though in terms of international standards, 100k isn't really that much compared to middle-class wages in other countries, and we have pretty high taxation and pretty high cost of living without much public service to show for it. But then the big but is that we don't need to be talking about wages at all. That's a really big distraction, and a really good distraction technique for the Tories to get into this discussion, to try and talk about £100,000 earners as if they're just kind of normal people, even though they're in the top 2-3%. First of all, because it helps them try and drive a wedge between the haves and the have-nots. But also, it lets us not focus on the real issue, which is wealth inequality and not income inequality. People are obsessed talking about wages. You earn this, I earn this. Well, really and truly, it's how many assets do you have? Well, Jeremy Hunt, as a cabinet minister, gets £150,000 a year, so that's top, 1.5% of earners in the UK. He's clearly in the top couple of percentiles with a very high wage there. But crucially, the man's got 7 properties. His asset wealth is considerably higher than basically everybody who's a millennial in this country. Jeremy Hunt could go down to being paid nothing tomorrow, and it wouldn't matter. because it would still be wealthier in asset wealth than everybody else. People who make the most money in our society don't have a wage. They get paid in capital gains. They get paid in dividends. And isn't it weird how all of those rich people in society pay way lower taxes than us, working people, whether we earn £25,000 a year or £50,000 a year or even £100,000 a year, we all pay less tax as a percentage of our income than people who make their money from capital gains or from dividends, i.e. people who don't work. People who are the real scroungers in our society, people who sit there collecting passive income, i.e. stolen wages, from other people who are actually productive in society. And that's why I think that this 100k discourse is a bit of a red herring, even if it does make Jeremy Hunt really look like the 80k guy from Question Time. The deluded section of the UK who think that they're not well off or privileged, financially speaking, when they're on like top 2-3% incomes. They're not the super rich. They're not the real enemy here. You know, consultants on 110k are not the enemy. The enemy are people who own everything. The private equity companies who own everything. The landlords who own all the houses. Those are the real enemies.
No, I said that because I was talking to a constituent of mine in Godalming who was saying that even on what most people would think, and she recognised that is what most people would consider as a very high salary, when you have house prices around £670,000, you're paying for childcare, it doesn't go as far as you think. And that's why...
well, yeah, that's because you're living in Godalming in Surrey. That's because you're living in an incredibly posh and expensive area. You get houses for like 100k in Workington, but there's just no jobs because guess what? You destroyed all the jobs in those areas because you're the Conservative Party. Yeah, of course you destroyed jobs in Workington.
Under the Conservatives, we say that we shouldn't take the higher level of tax that has been necessary to deal with the costs of the pandemic and the energy crisis as permanent. And when it's affordable and responsible for people at all income levels, we would like to bring taxes down.
But on that point, though, I just want to press you on this because you did say 100,000.
Again, they always talk in terms of taxation. Even though I have plenty of trouble, I have plenty of issues with the taxation system that we have in this country. I have plenty of issues. I've detailed them a long time. I don't like national insurance. I think income taxes are too high. I think we need wealth taxes. I think capital gains and dividend taxation should be increased for a reduction in income tax. I have some issues with that. But wages are the issue here. An extra, 450 quid in your pocket every year if you're like a 35k earner, which is also getting partially wiped out with fiscal drag anyway over the next 5-year period. That's really kind of chump change. Whereas, a 2, 3, 4% higher pay rise than we have right now would be gigantic in terms of the amount of actual money that you'd have extra in your pocket on those incomes. But of course, he doesn't want to talk about wage rises because Conservatives consistently and constantly campaign on political policy that means that wages don't increase properly. It's called supply-side labour market reform. So things like reductions in benefits, reduction in trade union bargaining power, a reduction in employee benefits, all of those things, all of these bring down wages overall.
£1,000 is not a huge salary when you have a mortgage to take in. Even in your own area, in Surrey, the average full-time wage is not even half of that. It's £42,000. So don't you think, to many people hearing you say that, actually that just sounds completely out of touch?
Well, I was talking to one of my own constituents who was saying that, and I do accept that even on those higher salaries, people feel under pressure. But as you mentioned, the average salary in the country, it's £35,000. Mm-hmm. And what did I do for people on £35,000 in the budget? I've reduced their national insurance contributions by £900 in the next year. What did I do for people on an even lower salary, the national living wage, the lowest legally payable wage? That's gone up by a record amount to £11.44, which means if they work full time, they'll get an extra £1,800. So my commitment and the people I prioritised is actually people on lower salaries.
But with fiscal drag, people on like the lowest salaries are actually going to pay more tax as a proportion of their income than people are on 35k. So what you did is you prioritised middle earners because they're the swing demographic, and even then they didn't even get that much. And even then, they don't even seem to care because what's the difference between that little extra money each month when your NHS doesn't work and your kid's school is collapsing? But
I do recognise that everyone is feeling pressure, yes.
And also all our viewers know, because we've talked about it a lot, that actually by the end of this Parliament, most people will be worse off. Those are statistics and calculations done by independent organisations. And yet, the Prime Minister is busy telling people the economy is bouncing back. even though lots of people are still having a really hard time, do you really think, after everything that's happened, after the Liz Truss market meltdown, one of our viewers, Susan Larby, has spelt it out really clearly. She's written to us to say, I find it amazing that a government who oversaw this are boasting of achievement. Another viewer, Ian Metcalf, has messaged us this morning saying, do not allow the Chancellor to claim responsibility for the fall in inflation. All they've done is wait for energy costs to come down. What do you say to those people getting in touch with us to say you shouldn't be crowing about progress when people have had such a hard time?
Well, what I would say to people like Susan is we're certainly not. What we're actually trying to do is things that help families up and down the country. So one of the things we did that helped the fall in inflation was the energy price guarantee, which paid for half of people's energy bills, but also because we have the energy price cap has meant that prices have not risen as fast as they might. But you talk about living standards.
Okay, time to debunk yet more nonsense misinformation. Or I guess I say misinformation, what I really mean is skewed perceptions being put forward here. It's a skewed perspective. To say, well, we were really generous because we subsidised half of people's energy bills. Okay, the reason you had to do that is because your garbage energy policy for the past 14 years, or I guess past 12 years at the time when the energy price cap was instituted, is what led us to having the highest increase in payments in some of the Western world. Certainly some of the highest increases in our bills in Europe. So you had to do more to subsidise our bills than we would have done had you not had crappy energy policy. Again, there's a reason why Norway's bills didn't go up. There's a reason why France's bills didn't go up. First of all, because they've got nationalised energy industries. And second of all, is because they've divested from fossil fuels, which were the big spike in energy prices during that period. The big spike in energy prices was due to the increase in wholesale price of oil and gas on global markets, and because we were over-reliant on oil and gas to produce electricity and to heat our homes, it massively increased all of our bills, and a larger proportion as Norway, who relies on hydroelectricity, didn't go up at all during the energy crisis, or France, where they rely on nuclear, didn't go up at all during the energy crisis. So that's your fault. Sure, you made sure our bills stayed at the same place, but you wouldn't have had to have done that if you had proper energy policy for however many years you're in government. And now we've got a gigantic debt to GDP ratio, and that's your fault because of your failures in terms of dealing in long-term policy planning. But of course, there is no long-term state planning under neoliberalism.
What has actually happened since 2010? They've gone up in real terms by about £1,700 for the average family. But obviously when you have a pandemic and an energy crisis, they're going to take a hit. What was encouraging was that the Office for Budget Responsibility, completely independent from the government, said that we are going to recover to pre-pandemic living standards next year, 2 years earlier than they originally thought. So although we're...
Okay, you're going to get to pre-pandemic living standards in 2 years from now. That's a very long time away. And even then, pre-pandemic living standards were also stagnant in terms of where we were in 2010. So in 14 years of Conservative government, we're not even back where we started in 2010. I have lots of criticisms of the new Labour administration, mostly from the left, but the fact that these guys cannot even claim, they can't even make the claim that in 2 years' time we'll be back to where we were in 2010, just shows you how terrible this government is for ordinary people.
We are not out of the woods yet. People are feeling a lot of pressure. We can see that now inflation has come down. Living standards, which the OBR thought was actually going to fall last year, have actually risen. We can see that we are turning a corner, but we need to stick to the plan we've got because it is beginning to bear fruit.
But we've seen this week.
Yeah, turning a corner is when we're in a recession, guys. That's how that works.
And you can see what you're trying to do politically here. You know, the Prime Minister says, the economy is bouncing back. You are trying, perhaps in a slightly more subdued way, to emphasise that things are turning. But do you really think that the public is ready to hear that when people have been so hard pressed? We hear it every week from viewers. Inflation was so high, and when it was so high, you said, that's not down to us, that's because of Ukraine. Now it's coming down. It does sound like you're asking for credit.
Well, let me tell you what we're trying to do politically. It was very straightforward as far as I'm concerned. The main reason...
And it tells you exactly how, UK journalists, especially at the BBC, haven't got a clue about actual economics. And secondly, it shows just where it looks like they want to position themselves in terms of political rhetoric, is that at no point during any of this, as Laura Kuenssberg even talked about, well, what do wages look like? What are wages in comparison to inflation? She won't do that, because that's what actually would solve the question. It's what actually would point out to Jeremy Hunt and the Conservative Party and conservatism as an ideology. Remember, that's what's at fault here. I know I say it every stream, but I'm going to hammer it into you people that we need to be talking about the ideology that these people operate under, and not indeed bad party, me no like do bad thing. While they are that, they are doing that because of their ideology, not because there's something magical about people who wear a certain colour rosette. Really important point that. But she won't press it home. She won't even talk about the fact that wages are the real issue here. There's also worth pointing out as well, people in the tight labour market period at kind of the start of 2023, late 2022, just when there was a really tight labour market and wages were increasing, and there was always this scaremongering about a wage price spiral, and the Bank of England trying to warn against that by hiking interest rates far more than they needed to. One point people made was, well, actually, private sector wages are increasing heavily. They were like 8% when inflation was like 10%. It's worth pointing out that when you took away like financial sector bonuses or high salary bonus scheme payments, which got paid out pretty heavily during that period, actual private sector wages were only increasing by about 5% and public sector only about 3 to 4%. So before the wave of strike action happened, just when interest rates were going up, there was all the discussion about high wage rises, but it wasn't actual wage rises. It was mostly pay going up for certain groups of people rather than the broader private sector at large.
People vote Conservative is because they trust us to take the tough and difficult decisions that gets the economy back on track. Now, in the last few years,
the economy has been off track
exactly,
wildly for a long time.
Not for a long time. In the last since 2010, we've talked about this before, we've grown faster than countries like Germany. But yes, in the last 3 years, we had a once-in-a-century pandemic. We had a 1970s-style energy shock. And what they've seen from this Conservative government is that we've taken the really difficult decisions. I think the first time I spoke to you, the first interview I gave after I became Chancellor, I had to put taxes up, very difficult for a Conservative Chancellor. I had to cut back public spending plans. And those very difficult decisions, what they expect from a Conservative government, we can now see they're bearing fruit.
But those difficult decisions were taken by you as Chancellor because the person who sat in your chair before you had made huge unfunded tax cuts that sent the markets completely crazy.
Well, that was a mistake, but that was corrected very quickly. And in fact, in terms of the markets, they reflected that correction very quickly. The reason why inflation was 11.1% when I took over is, I'm afraid, because Putin decided to invade Ukraine, and that caused a global energy crisis. And that's in common with countries like America, France, Germany. We've all...
Not France. Not France. Germany, yes. America, less so. America has their own oil, so didn't have to care as much. Germany divested from nuclear, so that's their own fault. Thank you, Annalena Baerbock. Really glad to hear about your plans for keeping the German economy afloat. But France didn't have that issue because of the invasion of Ukraine and the oil and gas prices, because they used nuclear power.
Felt the impact of that. That took very difficult decisions, but there's a way to go. But I think we are making progress, yes.
Let's talk then about...
Hey, thank you for the mug purchase. Much appreciated, eh? Thank you. Also worth pointing out again that EDF was fully nationalised by Macron. France have a higher debt to GDP ratio than we do, and Macron had enough money from the magic money tree to purchase the remaining private shares of EDF to make it entirely state-owned during the energy crisis, and they capped their bills at a 4% rise. No fiscal expansion to pay for half of people's energy bills, just capped the bills at 4%, so the EDF could provide affordable energy for everybody using their nuclear power stations, because they had homegrown energy that wasn't just flogged from global businesses like Shell, BP, Centrica, etc. That's how you smartly manage an energy economy. I can't believe I have to praise Macron. I praised him for calling for a ceasefire, now I'm praising him over energy policy. What am I doing? What world is this? To be fair, Macron is to the left of Labour Party on this one too.
The next few months, because everybody knows the economy is likely to be top of the list at the general election. Now, your rival Rachel Reeves was here a couple of weeks ago, and you're both sometimes criticised inside your own parties and outside for, sounding a little bit similar. And some of the things you say are actually remarkably similar. I just want to show you a couple of things. Higher growth means more opportunity, more prosperity, and more funding for our public services. Economic growth is essential for raising living standards and funding strong public services. Now, can you tell us which one of you said which sentence? Because they are remarkably similar.
I can tell you because I wrote the sentence at the top of my myself, so it was me. But yes, I agree. And let me answer your question directly.
Well, let's first see if you got it right. Let's see if you got it right.
Yes,
You
I
did
did.
guess it
I got
right,
it
so
right.
you remembered writing that phrase. But do you accept that there does seem to be an awful lot in common?
Well, the first thing I say is I like and respect Rachel Reeves. And I think now this week is a big turning point because she's given a 1-hour lecture in which she's said what her economic policies are. There are some very profound differences. And you were talking about the cost of living crisis. I mean, the question is not simply how do we get through current difficulties, but how do we move decisively to higher growth, higher living standards? And to do that, we've got to confront very difficult questions. And I would say there are probably 3 that we need to confront. I don't think Rachel has confronted those this week. Let me give you one. If we're going to grow the economy, that means businesses are going to hire more workers. Is that going to come from more migration or making work pay with the 6 million adults of working age who are not in work and not at university? Now,
I mean, literally either. You create more jobs, the higher population that you have.
she didn't mention welfare reform or controlling migration once in over 8,000 words of a speech.
But are
we
you
have
saying-
introduced.
I mean, they want to follow your welfare plans, basically. If you look at people like Liz Kendall and Jonathan Ashworth, who were the previous shadow DWP secretaries, they both want to basically keep the same welfare. His welfare reform essentially is murder disabled people, which, you know, I mean, given that we have disabled activists absolutely shouting about how Labour, again, are promising not to really overhaul what the Tories have created over the last 14 years, which is essentially like a disabled people's euthanasia factory. I hate to, over-embellish, but loads of disabled people literally died during the austerity period. The fact that we had UN special rapporteurs say that we were violating the human rights of the disabled and creating a calamitous situation. I don't think that's necessarily an overreach to say they just created an abattoir for disabled people in the Department for Work and Pensions. If you want wages to increase, you want more welfare. Lower welfare reduces wages because then you're competing with less.
Free childcare. We've changed the rules on pensions so that people in their 50s want to carry on working. Mel Stride's plans to bring people back into work will help 1 million people back into work. Making work pay is a profoundly important part of the economic change we need to see.
Stodds from Labour.
Right. Okay, so let's get to one of the actual differences between the two of them. So currently, at time of recording, on Labour's policy platform, they are trying to institute fair pay agreements, which I think is just in social care at the moment. But it's the idea of having, a wider trade union who have a bargaining agreement with the state in terms of the employment with regards to social care and their national care service. That would increase wages. Better trade union bargaining by repealing the Trade Union Act from 2016, which Labour are also planning to do at time of recording, would also increase wages because they'd be able to bargain for better wages. What's your plan for increasing wages, Jeremy? How are you going to get higher wages when you make it harder for them to bargain? You're currently allowing the central bank to kneecap wages by keeping interest rates high. And you're also having employers compete for less because the state is cutting back on the welfare receipts. So you're doing the opposite. You're actually driving wages down with your recon policy.
From Labour later, but are you saying if there's a big difference on welfare, which you are saying, do you believe actually you can make it harder for people to claim benefits then in order to get them back into work?
I think it's a mixture of carrot and stick, but Labour have actually ruled out sanctions. That's a very big thing, and I think we need to say that people who are out of work would be much better off in the majority of cases in work, and we need to do that. Can I just tell you something else though?
Okay, well, first of all, sanctions don't get people back into work. Every study that's been done on this tells you that the sanctions regime never actually got anybody back into work. It did nothing to get people back into work. All it did was kill people. It didn't even save any money. Administering the tests in terms of sanctions cost so much in administrative fees, it saved the exchequer nothing. All it did was punish people, because these people are sick and twisted.
Very profound difference. How are we going to create the jobs of the future for our children?
But I just want to be clear on that point.
Okay.
Would you tighten and increase sanctions then on people to get them back to work? It sounds like that is what you're saying. It should be harder still to claim benefits.
Well, that's what Mel Stride has said, and he said if people are out of work after 18 months, he will require them to do a work placement. And
oh yeah, so slavery. Yeah, right. That's it. If they're out of work for 18 months, we will enslave them.
Changes in the work capability assessment that he's already announced, the Office for Budget Responsibility say 400,000 fewer people will be getting the higher level of benefit. But can I just go back to jobs? Because this is you asked about differences. We've had many challenges. You've talked to me about them on many occasions with the British economy. One thing we've been very good at is creating jobs. 4 million additional jobs since 2010. That's 8,000 people every single working day that the...
Right, how many? 4 million extra jobs since 2010. UK population over time. Let me have a look. Since 2010 to now, the population has increased by 6 million. Actually, about 5 million. 5 million has been the increase in terms of the people in this country, with labour force participation rate in this country is about 67%, 65%. Actually, really and truly, the population has gotten bigger. That's all that's happened, is that the population has increased. So that means nothing. We've created 4 million new jobs, right? There are 5 million more people in the UK. That's nothing.
Conservatives have been in office. Now, the question is, how do we sustain that? And what we have now is, Rachel Reeves did talk about that. She talked about Labour's New Deal for workers. You have the president of the CBI, completely independent of government, saying that risks destroying the job-creating factory that the UK has become.
But you have also presided over, and you've mentioned it yourself, a lot of people falling out of the workplace, often due to ill health, often because they can't get the treatments that they need because NHS waiting lists.
I love how he's saying, well, actually, the really big bad thing is, the bad thing that Rachel Reeves are proposing is basically the only good thing that they're proposing, which is higher wages. Right? When he says the chair of the CBI, he's talking about Rupert Soames, grandson of Winston Churchill, the guy who was also the CEO of Serco, who magically got billions of pounds worth of government contracts during the pandemic, whose brother was a Conservative Party MP. And we're going to invoke this guy specifically, saying, well, actually, all you little worker people, all you guys getting higher wages, that's bad, actually. Because that destroys jobs, even though there's no evidence for this. But it would destroy jobs if all the little worker bees actually got paid fairly for the jobs that they do. Not that I think that it'll make the touch paper when it comes to actually being implemented as policy once Labour get into power, very much an at time of recording moment. But the fact that the Conservative Party are going to attack Labour for wanting to have better workers' rights just shows you who these people work for. I have Labour campaigners in my audience and in my family who will tell me consistently that the thing that they most get good feedback on when they knock on doors, now that the £28 billion pledge is gone, it's the increase in workers' rights, it's the banning zero-hour contracts. Yet here's the guy who's the Chancellor of the Exchequer saying, well, the bad thing that Labour are going to do is let you get paid more. Given that I've just explained in the last segment, when he was wittering on about inflation, that the only way to actually increase living standards is to have increases in wages. And here he is, having never mentioned wages once, of course Laura Kay didn't up until this point, now saying, well, actually the really bad thing that we could do would be to increase wages right now. Because these people are scum. They're actual scum. Because, of course, why should he care whether wages go up? He gets paid 150k guaranteed from the state regardless and can choose how much he gets paid based upon the recommendations and then voting it through Parliament. And on top of that, he's making a hand over fist as a fucking landlord, so he doesn't have to care about a wage because he doesn't do any actual work for that money.
Are so long. But it's interesting, you've clearly articulated there, I think, that you are open to squeezing the welfare budget further and making it harder for people to claim. On a different form of payment, though, when it comes to pensioners, what about the triple lock? Because you hinted this week that the triple lock, which guarantees pensioners' income, keeps pace with inflation. You hinted that might be reviewed, but will the triple lock be in the Tory manifesto this time round?
Well, I can confirm it will be, yes. And there's two very important things I would say about that. When we came to office in 2010, pensioners were more likely to be in poverty than other income groups. Now, because of the triple lock that we introduced, they are less likely to be in poverty. And I think that's a very important social change because unlike adults of working age, pensioners can't work, they've retired. And so we need to respect that. But the second thing I would say is that is an expensive commitment.
It's a very expensive
and you can
commitment.
and you can only make that commitment if you're confident that you're going to deliver the economic growth that's going to...
It's true. If you press the big red growth button, you'll be able to pay for the pensioners' payments. But also what's interesting is you want to reduce migration, which is a way of being able to increase the size of the productive capacity of the economy. We have a shrinking workforce due to low birth rates, which is going to get even worse as the gigantic boomer cohort retire, who's going to pay for their pensions if migration goes down? Like, they literally are trying to incinerate all votes they ever get in the future from young people, because our tax burden will massively increase once boomers start retiring. The productive capacity goes down, and our taxes are going to pay for their pensions, right? Again, really worth pointing out, that's who pays for pensions. You don't pay into the state pension when you work. Current workers pay for current pensioners. As I mentioned on the last stream, it is literally an incapacity benefit for pensioners. It's a welfare payment to pensioners because they cannot work. And it should be like that, and we should have a triple lock. These are all things that we should have, but we need to take strategic economic decisions to ensure that we can therefore afford that in terms of the productive capacity of the economy, which these guys want to kneecap in the future to satisfy the people in their voter base who just don't want to see brown faces at the supermarket. It's really frustrating that our future prosperity is being kneecapped by the fact that racist boomers don't want to spend their life around migrants. Very, very frustrating, because we need this. We need this to have economic prosperity for our generation, and we're getting rid of it. But it is also funny that, first of all, right, you see all the double speak that's going on here. First of all, right, he wants benefit payments to go down for actual disabled people and essentially threaten them into working. Yet when it comes to the benefits that old people get, which is the state pension, it has to rise with a triple lock as well. So either 2% or inflation or average wage increases. So whilst the boomers who are on, or the retired even, whilst the retired have had the state pension that's continually increased with inflation, so they've had no cost of living crisis. There's been no cost of living crisis for people on the state pension because they've had their payments continually match inflation. Yet workers, first of all, aren't supposed to get pay rises that match inflation. We have to deal with our living standards going down. We have to pay high taxes to pay for those state pensions. And on top of that, if we want to bargain for higher wages, the government tell us you can't have that because there might be a wage price spiral. It's so hypocritical.
Pay for it. And what we saw in the budget was, because we have a plan for growth, the OBR say that we will get back to 2%-ish growth over the next few years. That means that we can start to make that very important.
But I want to be completely clear on this. You've said it will be in the manifesto, the triple lock. Will it be in the Tory manifesto that it will be in place to protect pensioners' incomes for the whole duration of the next Parliament if the Conservatives were to surprise the polls and actually turn things around?
Absolutely. We made that commitment to pensioners, and we think it's a very important one.
Let's talk about another difference between the two parties. If the economy does grow convincingly, and if you are still in charge, if there's money to spare, what's your priority? Giving more of that back to tax or putting that into public services that many people believe desperately need cash?
Well, those two questions are totally linked, because you can't have, and let me answer it very directly, because we do want to bring down the tax burden. And by the way,
oh, don't get me wrong, Johnny Junglist, you're absolutely right. I made sure to very specifically state, I think the state pension rising and having it be, at least somewhat high is a really good thing. If there's one thing I will say about it, our reduction in pensioner poverty under the Conservative government is admirable. I think it's absolutely 100% admirable. I just think that it is incredibly hypocritical, and it shows you what they prioritise, that they will always talk about how pension increases are good, and I would agree with them. Yet wage increases are bad. They take active steps to reduce wage increases. They've squished wages for the last 14 years because they've done supply-side labour market reform. And on top of that, they'll attack other benefit holders for being scroungers whilst doling out the benefits to pensioners. I think it would be a good thing if welfare was high, because we value the lives of people who can't work, if wages were increasing because we value those who are productive, and if the pensions were increasing because we value the contribution of these people throughout their lifetimes. All of these things are possible. But you know what the main thing is, stops us from doing these three things, right? Because there's one other people who want to dig their hands into the pie. There's one other type of person, whether it be people getting money from the state through use of public services or through benefit payments, whether it be incapacity, out of work benefits, disabled benefits, or the state pension. And the people who work, right? There's one other person who wants to take money away, and that's the ownership class. Those are the capitalists. Those are the landlords. They want to get their hands in the trough as well, right? If they're paying more in wages, they're taking less for themselves. If they're paying more in taxation, in terms of corporation tax, that means less for wages and less for benefits. Remember, if they pay higher wages, they pay higher tax on those wages, so there's even more money for the exchequer if wages were increasing. So really and truly, the people who are benefiting on top of all of this are capitalists who are making money hand over fist. Record profits, more billionaires than we've ever had, but no money for welfare payments and no money for wage rises. We have to spend all of our money on the state pension and on our failing public services. We could tax the rich. We could have harder trade union laws so that the disparity between highest pay and lowest pay, the disparity between dividends and workers' wages would be smaller. We could get rid of capitalists altogether and have cooperative ownership. And then it wouldn't matter at all. There wouldn't be this extra fist kind of taking money out of the system whilst doing no work. But we never talk about the scrounging owners, do we? It's only ever, very specifically, disabled people faking it. They are having a disco. Very true, Katie. But we never talk secretly about the people who do take money out of the economy for doing nothing, and those are capitalists. Hey there, if you enjoyed the video, make sure that you like and leave a comment. That helps the video out in the algorithm. If you subscribe and ring the bell, it'll let you know when I go live. I stream every day on YouTube and Twitch. You can also follow all of my socials down in the description. And if you want to support me in a more financial manner, there's a join button for membership to just 99p to be a member on YouTube, as well as a Patreon, and there's some merch there as well. And hopefully I'll catch you on the next video. Take care.